And now reading from the scripture, reading from Mark 12 today. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." May we take these words into our hearts.
Super, thank you. Good morning. It is a pleasure and a blessing to preach here this morning, and it's also been a blessing to me to be a member of this congregation. And this morning it's fun to see you from the front. It was the autumn of my second year in seminary, and I was beginning my local church internship at New Hope United Church of Christ, which was then at 14th and Greenfield in the heart of the near south side of Milwaukee. New Hope's pastor and my internship supervisor was Reverend Sandra Graham. Sandy was smart, gregarious, and unflappable. I, on the other hand, was hardworking and enthusiastic, but had little idea of how to be a good ministerial intern. Sandy gave me various assignments during my internship. She told me that she was excited for me to teach the confirmation class. She gave me a rather large curriculum book and asked me to watch her teach the first class. 4 middle school age boys arrived at the door. Pastor Sandy opened it and held out her hands. She said, "Please give me any weapons and anything illegal you have on you. I'll give it back to you on your way out." The young men handed her 2 knives. She placed them in a box. We walked to a small table in the fellowship hall. She asked the guys to introduce themselves briefly, and then she told them about some of the things they'd be learning. To be honest, confirmation was not half as interesting then as it is these days. At the end of the lesson, she told them that I was going to be their teacher. That was not exactly welcome news. The guys said, "Oh man, why do we have to get stuck with the new girl? She's not going to be any good. We want you." After the general wailing stopped, all of us walked to the door, where Sandy stepped over to the box and handed back the objects she collected when the guys came into church. After they left, she turned to me. "So, how did you think that went?" "I am without words at the moment," I said as politely as I could. She laughed. "That good, eh? They really are good kids. They grow on you." I'll admit that it took me a while to get used to doing the weapons and illegal items check at the door, but the guys did start to grow on me right away. After we'd stayed pretty much with the curriculum for about a month, I told the guys that I had a special challenge for them. I could feel their curiosity, and I said, in addition to working through the lessons, I'd like to suggest that we do something very special. I'd like to teach you guys how to meditate. One of the students said, "Why do we want to meditate?" I said, 2 reasons. 1, it's going to make you feel good, peaceful. And the other, I'm going to make each one of you a deal. All of a sudden, their backs were straight and they were leaning forward. What's the deal? If you're in, we're going to start tonight with 15 seconds of meditation. I want to make you a deal that if you attend 90% of confirmation classes, and that if together we get to 15 minutes of meditations, each one of you can ask me to fulfill one special wish. That wish must be approved by both me and Pastor Sandy. I'm going to give the four of you a few minutes to talk about it by yourselves. Then, when I come back to the table, I'm going to ask each of you to tell me if we have a deal. Okay? The guys nodded and started to talk quietly. I took off and gave them a few minutes to chat with each other before coming back. I looked around our circle. Deal? I looked at each student. I heard back 4 times. Deal. Our reading from Mark today tells us, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had, all she had to live on. During that year of confirmation classes, those young men learned how to meditate. I saw them putting in everything they had. We traveled a long spiritual journey together, one that began with lessons that were pretty silent at first, but then they started asking questions, real questions. Questions about anything and everything, about God, about life, about why things happen the way they do. Why are some people poor and other people rich? Why people sometimes get hurt and die. Out of their poverty, they put in everything they had, all they had to live on. I first became interested in meditation when a friend introduced me to a Unitarian Universalist minister in Milwaukee who is a Buddhist. She was, and still is, one of the most peaceful people I know. After I spent some time with her, I was certain I wanted what she had. When I told her that, she encouraged me, to begin meditating. It changed my life. Jack Kornfield, who is an American Buddhist and mindfulness meditation teacher, says that learning to meditate is like training a puppy. Think about what happens when you're with a brand new puppy. What's the first thing that you try to teach that lovable, warm bundle of fur? Perhaps to sit? Well, it sounds good, but it might happen around 25 to 50% of the time, right? And what happens in between? Well, that's the most fun of all. Running, sniffing, eating everything in sight, especially if it smells bad, stealing shoes or slippers, slobbering, and kissing, lots of kissing. And so it goes with learning how to meditate. Training our minds to be quiet so that we can sit is a lot like training a puppy. Our minds don't want to be quiet at all in the beginning. One of my meditating friends thought that he was giving me a very helpful suggestion in telling me to go and sit with the Dharmadhatu monks on the east side of Milwaukee early in my meditation practice days. I gamely went over there. My puppy's tail was wagging as I walked in their front door. As soon as I walked in, though, I realized that all they had for people to sit on were teeny tiny little benches, hard, wooden, teeny tiny little benches. This was a long time ago, before I had a disability. But a certain part of my anatomy was not very happy at all about sitting on a teeny tiny little wooden bench for what felt like 3.5 weeks. I was sweating profusely and starting to wonder if I was going to have to ask for help in getting up when thankfully the monk rang the meditation bell and invited everyone to stand. I was the only person in the room who had to get on all fours before I could stand up. But at that point, I really didn't give a hoot about my dignity. I was grateful that I didn't actually have to crawl to the front door, or that they didn't have to call the fire department to help me get out of there. It turned out that his bell signaled halftime, but for me, it signaled the end of the session. I gave the monk a respectful, sweaty bow and walked very slowly to my car. When my friend asked me a few days later how I enjoyed the meditation at Dharma Dhatu, I said, I don't think that I'm advanced enough to sit with those guys down there. I didn't have the courage to tell him that I probably would not be advanced enough even in the next life. Our reading from Mark today tells us, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had, all she had to live on. I very much felt the poverty of experience in that Buddhist meditation room, painfully so. I put in everything I had, but I knew it would not be my meditation home. The puppy in me could not stop jumping around in that small meditation room. I continued, though, to practice my meditation on a regular basis, to read and study it. I joined a meditation and Buddhist study group at a Unitarian Universalist congregation when I was serving as a chaplain on the East Coast. And a few years later, when I began doing some interims, I started up meditation groups in 3 Unitarian Universalist congregations. I'm happy that all of the groups are still going today. I think that there is a special need for silence in our world that is filled with lots of noise. Our silence can be a place to set aside our questions, our fears, our doubts, and our worries, and leave them for a while. In the silence, we may find a deeper calm, a warmer comfort, and a sense of God's presence right there with us. I was a United Church of Christ hospital chaplain for 25 years. It was one of the biggest blessings of my life. I remember the last patient I saw at St. Luke's Medical Center before I left the hospital to become an interim minister. One of the chaplains paged me to let me know that a patient had requested a Buddhist chaplain. She asked if I was free. I was, and she told me that the patient was upstairs in one of the intensive care units. As I walked off the elevator toward the ICU, I heard someone yelling. I walked into the ICU and asked the unit clerk for the room number of the patient who had asked to see a Buddhist chaplain. She looked at me and asked, "Do you hear the yelling?" I nodded. She said, "Well, that's your room, chaplain." I thought, well, it's a good thing I have good hearing as I walked down the hallway, listening for the source of the yelling. I knocked on the patient's door and said, "Mr. Doe, I'm Marcia, and I'm the Buddhist chaplain. May I come in, sir?" Mr. Doe stopped yelling and stared at me. He said, "You don't look like a Buddhist." I looked back at him. "All due respect, sir, neither do you." He looked at me with the tiniest of smiles. "Have a seat." I thanked him. "I heard you yelling as I walked up the hallway. I'm wondering if you can tell me why." "No one is listening to me, not the doctors or the nurses." "What would you tell them if they listened to you?" I asked. "I don't want any more treatments. I'm done. I just want to go home." Leave me alone. I'm capable of making this decision. Please, let me go home. I listened to him and nodded. I can't make any promises, Mr. Doe, but I'll convey what you've told me to your doctor and the nurses. In the meantime, would you like to meditate with me? A big smile crossed his face. I would like that a lot. He sat back in his bed. I sat back comfortably in my chair. We meditated together for about 10 or 15 minutes. I moved my feet slightly to give him a nonverbal signal that I was going to stop, and he opened his eyes. He said, "I need to take something back." I asked, "And what's that?" He told me, "You are a Buddhist. I'm sorry for earlier." I told him that he owed me no apology and that I was happy to meet him. I said that I was on my way to talk to the nursing staff and to write a note for his doctor in his chart. I wished him the best. I was thrilled the next morning when I returned to his room and discovered he'd gone home. Our reading from Mark today tells us, "But she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Mr. Doe didn't feel like he had much power while he was a hospital patient. He gave everything he had. In this case, he yelled. It was all he had to live on. It helped him to get home. Now, I bet by this time you're wondering about those 4 young men in their confirmation class. Let me catch you up with them. About 5 months into their classes, we were meditating at the beginning of each class. It always seemed to work best when all of us were fresh and not too tired. One night, with all of our eyes closed, I heard the door open and someone walk past us, but didn't think too much about it because several church leaders had keys and would enter the building to set up rooms for meetings or other church events. That night, after the guys had gone home, I was packing up my backpack when Pastor Sandy came out of her office. I was surprised to see her. She said, "Are you teaching the guys how to meditate?" I grinned. I wanted it to be a surprise when we were a little further along, but they're doing great. She was happy to see what we were doing. I told her about the deal that I made with each of the guys, what each special request was, and she approved all of them. This was terrific news. When we reached May, it was finally time. I congratulated the guys on accomplishing 90% in attendance for the confirmation class and getting to 15 minutes of meditation, and told them that I was ready to hold up my end for their requests. Tim asked me to take him to McDonald's to get a hamburger, French fries, and a soda. We had a really good conversation about school, his family, and what he wanted to do after high school. Mario asked me to come to dinner at his home. His mother and father welcomed me, and we enjoyed a delicious meal together. I was delighted to share Mario's brilliance with his parents, who already knew how special Mario was. Jerry just wanted to talk basketball with me. He and I both loved college hoops, so we spent extra time talking about our favorite teams and discussing March Madness. Hawk made a special request for confirmation morning. He asked me to pick him up at home at 7 a.m. He was wearing a brand new royal blue 3-piece suit. I told him that he looked pretty sharp. I asked him to wait at the front door of the church while I walked around the sanctuary to turn on all the lights that we needed. Then it was finally time. Hawk got onto his skateboard and raced down the middle aisle and up the sanctuary steps, jumped into the air, and caught the board with his right hand, and grinned so big that his face was brighter than all the lights in the sanctuary. "Marcia, can I do it one more time?" How could I resist that smile? Yes, but that's it then. I know. I promise I won't ask again. Hawk returned to the front door and stood on top of his skateboard like he was on top of the first place podium at the Olympics. And once more, he raced down the middle aisle, jumped up the sanctuary steps, and caught his board with his right hand. He flashed his grin again. I prayed silently. Dear God, thank you for letting me teach confirmation this year. What a blast. I told Hawk that we'd have to store his skateboard in the storage area behind the altar. He asked if he could go back there with me. I didn't realize what an interesting place it was until Hawk was back there with me. I told him that we'd needed to store his board and get out of there before people started arriving with food, drink, and other items for confirmation. Pastor Sandy's only stipulation to us was that no one was to see what we were doing that morning. So we needed to get down to the fellowship hall to help people set up coffee and treats very shortly. There are times in each of our lives when we feel a lack of something. This happens when we're grieving, when we're meeting physical challenges, or suffering emotional, physical, or spiritual pain. When we're experiencing disappointment or betrayal. When we're facing financial difficulties. When we or a loved one are dealing with addiction or other challenges. When any of these things or other situations that are challenging happen, we can feel impoverished of joy or courage, but hopefully just for a while. Our reading from Mark tells us, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had, all she had to live on. When we, out of our poverty, put in everything we have, when we take the time to be silent in the midst of noise, then I hope and pray that each one of us will know and remember that we are all loved by a powerful God whose love and mercy have no end. Thanks be to God. Blessed be.